Welcome to our Ancient Future story, Navigating Scripture Through the Eyes of Family, where I share with you biblical stories like a family member would share a story around the dinner table. As children of God, we are a part of God's family, and His family story has a lot of history. Each week, we will take one story and talk about it, the cultural, historical, geographical, and sociological impacts. We will be looking at the story from the perspective of our ancestors through the lens in ancient times in hopes of learning more about our family. This is our Ancient Future story. Welcome back to our Ancient Future story. I'm Vic, and I am so excited to share with you how Jesus flipped the script of Passover. We learned last time that Passover is a celebration and remembrance of the mighty acts of Yahweh in Egypt. But as Christ followers, we can also look back at Passover and remember the Last Supper and the mighty works of Jesus on the cross. In today's episode, I want to show you how Jesus flipped the script at the Last Supper with his disciples, and what it means for us as we take communion. So, grab your cup of coffee or something to drink, and let's get ready to dive into the story of the Last Supper with Jesus. Our story today opens with the disciples asking Jesus, "Where should we prepare the Passover?" And Jesus sent two of his disciples into town, i.e. Jerusalem, and told them a man carrying a jug would meet them, and they were to follow him, enter the house he enters, and tell the master of that house, "Rabbi wants to know if we can use your guest room to prepare for Passover with his disciples. And the master of the house will show you the large upper room that is fully furnished and ready." So the disciples did what Jesus told them, and they found the man and the house exactly as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. And when evening came, they gathered together in the upper room and were reclining at the table. They lit the candles and sang the blessing. They then talked about the patriarchs and the matriarchs and all those who came before them, as they put themselves in the mindset of being enslaved in Egypt. They then blessed and poured the first cup. They may have even read or recited Psalms 23 to remind them of their cup being overflown. Historical fun fact: the phrase "cup overflows" is a Jewish idiom to mean never runs out. If you were to have a meal with a Jewish person, every time you took a sip of your drink, they would refill it, and they would not let it go down until the meal was winding down. This is what "my cup overflows" means. So when they are reciting David's psalm to remind them that God is constantly refilling them. Then they would have washed their hands, but this is the first place where Jesus changes the script. Instead of going around the table and having each person dipping their hands into the water basin, Jesus stands up, takes off his outer garment, wraps a towel around his waist. He pours the water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with the towel that was around his waist. He came to Peter, and Peter said, "Master, do not wash my feet." But Jesus said, "I have to, or else you will have no part of me." Then Peter said, "Well then, don't just wash my feet, but my whole body also." Jesus said, "The one who has bathed does not need to be washed, except for their feet, because they are clean. You are clean, Peter, but not everyone is clean." Then Jesus stood up, put back on his outer garment, and took his seat back at the table. And he then tells his disciples why he must wash their feet. He tells them, "You call me Rabbi and Master, and rightly so, because I am. But if I have taken the place of a servant and washed your feet, so should you wash each other's feet. I have given you the examples so that you should go and do the same." After saying this, he blessed the bitter herbs and dipped them into the salt water to remember the tears and the bitterness of Egypt. But Jesus was troubled in the spirit and said, "One of you will betray me." And the disciples looked around at one another and asked, "Is it I, Lord?" Peter then motioned to John, who was reclining next to Jesus, to ask him who would betray him. So John leans over and asks, "Who is it, Lord?" And Jesus answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me." Judas Iscariot's hand was in the dish with Jesus. And he looked at Jesus and asked, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Okay, pause. Isn't it interesting that Peter and John and others sitting around the table call Jesus Master or Lord, but Judas Iscariot calls him teacher or rabbi? Judas never made Jesus the master of his life. Jesus was only a good teacher to him. Jesus tells Judas, "What you are going to do, go do it quickly." Now, no one at the table knew why he had said this to him. Some thought Jesus had told him to get what they needed for the feast, while others thought he was going to give some money to the poor. But we know that Judas got up and left the upper room to go turn in Jesus to the priest for 30 pieces of silver. In the middle of the table, there were 3 pieces of unleavened bread, called matzah. And after Judas left, Jesus pulled out the middle piece of the unleavened bread from the stack, and he held it up, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he changed the script again. He said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And just as it was custom, he put half of the broken matzah piece into the afikomen and hid it in the upper room. Then the disciples asked the 4 questions that usually children ask at Passover, to remember the story of the Exodus. Why on this night do we only eat matzah? Why on this night do we eat only bitter herbs? Why on this night do we dip them twice? Why on this night do we eat only reclining on pillows? And then they read the Passover story from Exodus 12 together. Then it's time to pour the second cup. This cup is the cup of plagues. And as they pour this cup, they remember the 10 plagues that came on Egypt, and how Yahweh took down the Egyptian gods. Then they sing the liturgy day anew, which means it would have been enough. And they remember how God protected them every step of the way, from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to the promised land. And after each part of the story, they say day anew, it would have been enough. Then they remembered the Passover lamb, and the sacrifice it gave to put the blood on the doorpost and mark their homes, so that the angel of death would pass over them and they would not lose the firstborns of their house. Then they partook for the second time in eating bitter herbs, this time blessing it and dipping it in horseradish to remember the torment of Egypt. And then they blessed and dipped the bitter herbs into the chereset, which is a sweet clay-like texture, to remind them of the clay bricks they were forced to make in slavery. Then they take the egg off the Seder plate and pause and mourn the destruction of the temple. It is a moment to remind them that what is missing in the world and from their spiritual lives. Then they will eat the Passover meal, the lamb with the bitter herbs and the unleavened bread. After the meal, it is time to find the afikomen. When they find it, they bless it and eat it. Then Jesus pours the 3rd cup. He blesses it, and then he changes the script again. He said, "This is the blood of my covenant, which is poured out for many. Do this in remembrance of me." The disciples then would have turned their attention to the empty place sitting at the table. This place setting was for the prophet Elijah. At this point, one of the disciples likely stood up and opened the door to the upper room for Elijah to enter in. And remember the words of Malachi, that one day God would send Elijah the prophet back to earth to make a way for the Messiah. But until then, Jews wait expectantly for Elijah to return, because they believe it would signal the arrival of the Messiah. Okay, side note. As I'm recording this, it's occurring to me that at this point, at least some of the disciples have professed Jesus as the Messiah. So it's interesting to think about them opening the door for and leaving a place setting for Elijah, when the Messiah is already sitting among them. I don't know if that is something they did, but it is interesting to think about, having the Messiah among them, yet still opening the door for Elijah. Then they would recite Who Knows One, which has a similar vibe to our 12 Days of Christmas, but it tells their story. They start at Who Knows One, and they work their way up to Who Knows 12. Who knows 12? I know 12. 12 are the tribes of Israel. 11 are the stars of Joseph's dream. 10 are the commandments. 9 are the months of childbirth. 8 are the days of circumcision. 7 are the days of the week. 6 are the sections of the Mishnah. 5 are books of Torah. 4 are the matriarchs. 3 are the patriarchs. 2 are the tablets of the law. 1 is our God in heaven and earth. Then they would bless and pour the 4th cup. Except Jesus does not partake in this cup. In fact, he says he will not drink of this cup until we are with him in his Father's kingdom. Then they sung the hymn from Psalms 118, "O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever." And when they had finished singing the hymn, they got up from the table and headed to the Mount of Olives, to the place called Gethsemane. And that is where our story ends for today. Jesus celebrating the Passover with his disciples, just like they had done at least twice before, but all of them had done their entire lives. But this time, Jesus made it personal. He knew what was about to happen to him in the coming hours, and he wanted to warn them, encourage them, and inspire them to hold on, because just as he knew he would die for the sins of the world, he knew he would come back to life, offering freedom and love to them and to us today. If you grew up in church, you have probably heard these stories many, many times, because these stories are told every time we take communion. And even if you didn't grow up in church, you probably heard this story or part of this story during Holy Week or on Easter Sunday. But I want to point out some things that will help shape the context of the story for us. The first, location. Our story takes place in Jerusalem in roughly 33 AD in the upper room or guest room of a man's house. Isn't it interesting that there is no room for Jesus in the guest room in Bethlehem the night he is born, but there is room for Jesus in the guest room right before he dies? Anyway, this room is still accessible in Jerusalem today and is visited by Christians in remembrance of the Last Supper and Pentecost. I have stood in this room, and it is massive. Solid stone walls and incredibly high ceilings. This room now has arches in it, but those would have been added since the time of Jesus and his disciples. But had we been there when Jesus was reclining at this table, we would have seen a U-shaped table low to the ground with pillows surrounding it, and the disciples leaning to the left. Jesus would have been sitting at the end of the table in the seat of the guest of honor, while Peter would have been sitting across from him on the other end of the U-shape in the seat of the servant, because he was helping prepare and serve the meal. Now, this may be a peculiar sight, but it's important for us to know that they were sitting on pillows because their ancestors were to partake in Passover in haste, as if they were going to leave Egypt as soon as possible. And they are reclining to the left because the left side is unclean. In this culture, the left hand was used for unclean things, like using the bathroom, whereas the right hand was used for clean things, like eating. So they lean to the left around the table, so we get this picture of them reclining. The first thing Jesus does to change the script was to get up and take the place of a servant and wash his disciples' feet. In this culture, it was custom for the servant of the house, or the one who was serving the meal, to wash the feet of the guests as they arrive. Remember, in first century Israel, they walked everywhere, and Israel is full of dusty roads and muddy terrain. And for sanitary purposes and for hospitality purposes, when a guest walked into a house, the servant of the master would wash the feet of the guest. On this night, Peter was the one sitting in the servant's chair, and Jesus was sitting to the seat of the guest of honor. I think it is interesting that Peter did not wash everyone's feet when they came into the upper room, as was custom. So Jesus, the master, the guest of honor, stands up, takes off his outer garments, wraps the towel around his waist, and washes the disciples' feet. And who is the one that refuses him to wash his feet? Peter, the very one whose job it was to wash the feet of the disciples. Peter knew that Jesus was taking his place as the servant, and Peter was hesitant to let Jesus wash his feet. But Jesus told Peter he must wash his feet, or else Peter can have no part in him. Jesus tells all of his disciples the reason he did this was to show them all how they are supposed to live. They are supposed to be servants, even if they are the most important or powerful person at the table. They are to lead like servants through inexplainable love, and it is by this that the world will know that you are his disciple. After this, Jesus gets the matzah and he takes it out of the middle of the 3-stack pile. This pile is usually understood to mean God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So when Jesus pulls out the middle piece and says, "This is my body," he is pulling himself out of the pile. And then he breaks it, and then they hide it. This is symbolic of the body being beaten, bruised, and buried. Jesus then gives some to his disciples to eat. And then after the meal, when they look for and find the afikomen, it is symbolic of his body being resurrected. The next thing I want to talk about is the cup of redemption. This is the third cup, and it is received after the Passover meal. The first thing we need to know about redemption is that it was originally a secular term. And redemption in the secular world meant to buy back. This usually applied to land, but could also be a person. But it was understood that to redeem something or someone, one must put their own resources on the line, their own life on the line, and claim it as their own. Even though this was a secular term, it was adopted into a religious term to explain how God redeems humanity. God puts his own resources on the line. He gives his own life for us, and he claims us as his own. And I love what Sandra Richter says in her series Epic of Eden. Jesus will redeem us no matter where we find ourselves, in unfortunate circumstances, captured by the enemy, or stuck in our own stupid decisions. So this is what the cup is about. Redeeming the people of Israel out of Egypt. But Jesus flips the script. He says, "This is the blood of my covenant," which would have immediately reminded the disciples of two things. The first is Moses at Mount Sinai in Exodus 24:8. When Moses seals the old covenant with blood, he sprinkles some of the blood against the altar, and then he throws the blood on the people standing around it as a sign for them to remember the covenant they had made with Yahweh. Then Moses said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all of these words." The blood is what seals the covenant between God and man at Mount Sinai. But here, Jesus is saying, this cup, this covenant, this time, the blood will be mine that is spilled as a way to seal the new covenant between God and man. And every time you take of this cup, it is a sign for you of the covenant we have made. The second thing the disciples would have thought about is the marriage covenant. Whenever a groom was to be married, at the time of his engagement, he would offer his bride-to-be a cup of wine and would say, "This is the blood of my covenant." And if the bride-to-be agrees to marry him, she would drink from the cup, and it would seal the covenant between them, the promise to be married. So when Jesus says, "This is the blood of my covenant" to his disciples, when they drink from this cup, they are agreeing to the covenant that he has made with them. Likewise, when we partake in communion, we hear these words, and when we drink from the cup, we are agreeing to this covenant between Yahweh and us. The next thing in the Seder meal is to open the door for Elijah. Now, this may seem weird to us, but it is actually the very hope of a Jewish person, that Yahweh would finally send the Messiah, and they believe the first sign of the Messiah will be the return of Elijah. So, who is Elijah? Elijah is a prophet who lived during the time of King Ahab. He is famous because he did not die. Instead, he was brought to heaven in a chariot of fire. 2 Kings 2:11-12 says, "And as they, Elijah and his assistant Elisha, went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw him no more." Then we flip over to Malachi 4 and read the last words of a writing prophet. This is believed to be the last words of Yahweh ever spoken to his people, that was ever written down. So for a Jewish person, these are the last words of Yahweh. So it's important and sacred to remember. And Malachi 4:5 says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes." So Jewish people believe that Elijah will mark the time of the Messiah's arrival. So they leave a place setting for him, and they open the door for him, because they are waiting expectantly for him to arrive. But Jesus also flips the script on this. Because in Matthew 11:10-11, and then 13 and 14, Jesus tells his disciples, This is he of whom it is written in Malachi 3. Behold, I will send a messenger before your face, who will prepare the way before you. Truly I say to you, among those born of a woman, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. Jesus claims John the Baptist to be Elijah they are waiting for. And John himself proclaims that he is paving the way for the Messiah. The next thing they would have done is the Who Knows One liturgy. And again, this is another way to reiterate their story. But I think it's important for us to go through them and acknowledge the value and importance of each of these. So we'll start at 12 and move down to 1. So who knows 12? 12 is the tribes of Israel. The tribes of Israel are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, whose 2 sons were Ephraim and Manasseh, and Benjamin. These are the sons of Israel. Who knows 11? 11 are the stars of Joseph's dream. In Genesis 37:9, Joseph, the son of Jacob, who got the coat of many colors, his brothers hated him, partly because he was the favorite, but also because he was having these dreams of his brothers bowing down to him. The 11 stars were reflective of his 11 brothers who had bowed down to him while he was second in command in Egypt. Who knows 10? 10 are the commandments. That would be the 10 commandments of God that gives the people of Israel in the wilderness. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall have no idols. You shall not take the name of Yahweh in vain. You shall keep the Sabbath day. You shall honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness, and you shall not covet. Who knows 9? 9 are the months of childbirth. This one we know. Who knows 8? 8 are the days of circumcision. They would circumcise on the 8th day because we now know from modern medicine that on the 8th day after a child is born, blood begins to clot. So they circumcise on the 8th day to avoid hemorrhaging. Who knows 7? 7 are the days of the week. We also know this one. It's part of the Sabbath. Work for 6 days, rest for the 7th day. Who knows 6? 6 are the sections of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was a collection of ancient Jewish commentary, written by rabbis whose writings were considered sacred text, similar to the way Christians uphold the epistles as sacred text. Who knows 5? 5 are the books of Torah. This is the holy law of Israel. It is the first 5 books of our Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Who knows 4? 4 are the matriarchs. These are the wives of the patriarchs, the founders of Israel: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Who knows 3? 3 are the patriarchs. These are the founders of Israel: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Who knows 2? 2 are the tablets of the law. This was the contract between Yahweh and Israel. It wasn't like we see in VBS and Sunday schools where there are 5 commandments on one side of the tablets and 5 commandments on the other. No, it was a contract with 2 copies. So one side had all the law written on it, and the other had all the law written on it. One belonged to Israel, and the other belonged to Yahweh. They were kept together in the Ark of the Covenant because that is where Yahweh dwelled. But it was also in the midst of Israel. And they would take it out periodically and read it before the people. Who knows 1? 1 is our God of heaven and earth. There is only one Yahweh. He is the triune God, the creator of all things. Which brings us to the last cup, the cup of praise. This was the victory shout of how Yahweh had rescued them out of Egypt. After they blessed this cup, they would sing the hymn of Psalm 118, which was often sung after victory in battle. Jesus doesn't drink this cup, though. In fact, he promises not to drink it until we are with him in the kingdom. And I think that is interesting, that he refused to drink the cup of victory before victory was fully found. He had not yet died for the sins of the world. Victory had not yet been won. And yet, when victory is one, and we are all with him in paradise. At the banquet of the Lamb, he will drink again the cup of praise. This is our hope, that we will get to spend eternity with God in heaven. So how does all of this point to Yahweh? Each time we gather together, we will talk about how the story points to Yahweh. In today's story, Yahweh is fulfilling the Passover feast by setting up his next greatest rescue. But this time, it's not just for the Israelites, but for all mankind. Through this meal, Jesus is telling his disciples what he is going to do and how this new covenant will be for both Jews and Gentiles. All are welcome to the table of Yahweh, and we wait expectantly for Christ's return and our eternity in heaven with him. So as we close our time together, I want to spend some time reading the scriptures from which our story comes from today. From across the Gospels, I hope that as we read this together, in light of everything we have learned, that this story will be illuminated for you. Let's read. Now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from the table. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist, and then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do not wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share in me." Simon Peter said, "Lord, not just my feet, but also my hands and head." Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to be washed except for his feet, but is completely clean. You are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that is why he said, "Not all of you are clean." When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If then your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, so shall you ought to wash the feet of others. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done for you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him." And as they were eating, he said, "Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful, and began to say to him one after another, "Is it I, Lord? Is it I?" He answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" He said to him, "You have said so. Now go and do what you are going to do quickly." So Judas Iscariot got up and left. Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom." Then they sang the hymn, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his steadfast love endures forever. Out of my distress I call on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. For what can man do to me? The Lord is on my side as my helper. I shall look in the triumph on those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. All nations surround me. In the name of the Lord, I cut them off. They surround me on every side. In the name of the Lord, I cut them off. They surrounded me like bees. They went out like a fire among thorns. In the name of the Lord, I cut them off. I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. Glad songs of salvation are in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand of the Lord exalts. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of the Lord. The Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me and have become my salvation. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Save us, we pray. O Lord, we pray. Give us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is good, and he has made his light to shine upon us. Bind the festal sacrifices with cords up to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I will give thanks to you. You are my God, I will exalt you. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. And when they had finished the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Thank you for listening to today's episode of our Ancient Future Story. I hope that you really enjoyed it. This episode was written and produced by me, Vic Harmon. Music is Embarking on an Adventure by Evan McDonald. Please support the show by subscribing and rating us. And if you would like to know more or grow deeper, check out our website at ourancientfuturestory.com. See you next time. Bye!